Last time, we covered the basics of two of the most well-known and probably most widely accepted virtues of character, bravery and temperance. In this video, we'll cover the rest of Aristotle's list of the 11 virtues of character, most of which are less familiar and some of which may be more controversial. However, at this point, we've already noticed, or we may have noticed, something about the way Aristotle seems to describe the motivation or the reason for which virtuous actions are done. Over and over again, Aristotle refers to these actions being done because they are fine, or for the sake of the fine. This motive, the fine, is not unique to bravery and temperance, but as we'll see shortly, is the underlying motive for all of the other virtuous actions as well. The fine is referenced in a number of passages in Aristotle's discussion of the first three virtues of bravery, temperance, and generosity. For instance, on page 48 in our text, right around, this is the Becker numbers 11, 15, B, 12 or so, section 2, he says, "The brave person is unperturbed as far as a human being can be. Hence, though he will fear even the sorts of things that are not irresistible, he will stand firm against them in the right way, as reason prescribes, for the sake of the fine, since this is the end that is aimed at by virtue." The fine is the end that is aimed at by virtue. And on the very next page, section 6, he says, "Now to the brave person, bravery is fine. Hence the end it aims at is also fine, since each thing is defined by its end. The brave person, then, aims at the fine when he stands firm and acts in accord with bravery." And we see this also in the discussion of temperance. If we go to 57, at the bottom of page 57, section 9, Aristotle writes, "Hence, the temperate person's appetitive part must agree with reason, for both his appetitive part and his reason aim at the fine. And the temperate person's appetites are for the right things in the right ways at the right times, which is just what reason also prescribes." In the next page, in the discussion of generosity that we'll get to in a minute, Aristotle says in end of section 7, beginning of section 8, the bottom of our page 58, "For it is more proper to virtue to do good than to receive good, and more proper to do fine actions than not to do shameful ones. And clearly the right sort of giving implies doing good and doing fine actions, or the right sort of taking implies receiving well or not doing something shameful." And in section 12 and 13, in the next page, he says, "Actions in accord with virtue are fine, and aim at the fine. Hence the generous person will also aim at the fine in his giving, and will give correctly, for he will give to the right people the right amounts at the right time, and all the other things that are implied by correct giving. Moreover, he will do this with pleasure, or at any rate without pain. For action in accord with virtue is pleasant, or at any rate painless, and least of all is it painful." And then finally, sections 33 through 35 on page 61. "Most wasteful people, however, as we have said, not only give wrongly, but also take from the wrong sources, and to this extent are ungenerous. They become acquisitive because they wish to spend, but cannot do this readily, since they soon exhaust all they have. Hence they are compelled to provide from elsewhere. At the same time, they care nothing for the fine, and so take away from any source without scruple, for they have an urge to give, and the way or source does not matter to them. This is why their ways of giving are not generous either, since they are not fine, do not aim at the fine, and are not done in the right way. So this is just a sampling of the many references to the fine in Aristotle's discussion of the first three virtues of bravery, temperance, and generosity. We'll see more such examples in his discussion of the rest of the virtues, which we'll be taking up shortly. In fact, it appears from the evidence of these numerous passages that for Aristotle, performing an action because it is fine is the common motive of all virtuous actions. Performing an action because it is fine, because it is a fine action, is the common motive for Aristotle of all the virtuous actions. And this naturally raises the question, what is the fine? And why is it the distinctively virtuous motive? So we'll take up these questions briefly here before we go on to discuss the other virtues. So, what is the fine? And why is it the distinctively virtuous motive? Why not something else? Why not maximizing goodness? Why not, promoting the avoidance of harm? Why not, serving the ends of humanity or something like that? Why the fine? Okay, so fine translates, as you can discover if you look at the glossary, translates the Greek kalos, which in other contexts would be translated as beautiful or perhaps noble. Beautiful or noble. So there's a sense or a connotation that the virtuous person acts for the sake of the fine because they're acting in a beautiful way, or they're acting in a noble way. In fact, some older translations of the Nicomachean ethics will say, instead of fine, they'll say that the person acts for the sake of the noble. And the sense here is of acting well or acting admirably. And admirably here in the sense of worthy to be admired, whether or not they actually are admired, but typically they will also be admired. These are actions that are admired by people. So acting admirably, but the primary sense here is acting in a way that's worthy of admiration. That's what it is to act fine. As with the beautiful, the action is an attractive or appealing one that both the agent performing the action and the onlooker would be pleased to view, typically. From this, we can see that fine here should be taken in the sense in which we speak of fine art or fine dining. That's why you have to put a little weight in your voice when you say, for the sake of the fine. This word should never be uttered in the way in which you might respond indifferently when someone asks you, how are you doing? And you say, fine. That's not the sense of fine. This is the fine, like fine dining. That was a fine meal. That is fine art. So, as with fine art and fine dining, there's a relation here to pleasure. And we saw in some of these passages that for the sake of the fine is meant to imply that this action is also a pleasant action for the person performing it. So that's one way to understand how it motivates, is that the person who performs an action for the sake of the fine enjoys it because it's a pleasant action to do. It's not only acting well or admirably or beautifully, but it's also a pleasant action to do. But it's important for us to make some qualifications here. The pleasure here is a disinterested one, an objective disinterested pleasure, as opposed to a personal subjective pleasure, a self-gratification. That's not what it is. In that sense, it's like the pleasure of fine art or even fine dining, where one is concerned to sort of savor the way in which the object that you're enjoying has been put together with such artistry. And it's not just a matter of, filling your face or gratifying your appetites. It's a kind of objective, disinterested pleasure. So that's the first point about the pleasure that goes along with fineness of an action. It's a pleasant action, a pleasure in an objective or disinterested sense. The fineness of the action is not a function of the way it serves the private self-interest of the agent, not even as a means to honor. And so we've already seen in the case of courage, and we'll see again, that for Aristotle, one doesn't perform an action with a properly virtuous motive if one does it for the sake of being honored. One does it for the sake of the fine. And honor is a pleasure that one relates to oneself, whereas the pleasure in the fine is a more aesthetic pleasure, a more objective, disinterested type of pleasure. Also, and this is also very crucial, if one is pleased to do the action because it is fine, this pleasure is in doing the action itself. It's not some extrinsic pleasure, as one might derive pleasure from, let's say, an electric massager, that you put on your shoulders or something like that. You derive pleasure from the pleasurable motions it produces in your muscles. But that sort of pleasure is extrinsic to the electric massager because it could be produced in some other way. Say by, jets in a hot tub, the water jets in a hot tub, or by a masseuse's thumbs massaging the same muscles. So the pleasure isn't in the electric massager, it's in the sensation that you're having in your muscles. And that's different from what's going on here in the pleasure of the fine. In this case, we're definitely talking about something that is in doing the action itself. It's in doing the action itself, not an extrinsic pleasure. And along with this is a third closely related point, which is that it is inextricable from the action. So you can't get the pleasure of doing a fine action, standing in the line of battle, for example, bravely, apart from the action itself. There's no way to, as it were, separate out the pleasure of performing that action from performing that action. There's no way to make a distinction, really, between the two. So what that is to say is that to perform an action because it is fine is to perform it in a basic sense for its own sake. So there's not an opposition between performing the action for its own sake and performing it because it's fine and taking pleasure in its fineness. Those are all really one thing. There's no requirement that in order to perform an action that's fine for its own sake, one has to somehow, be indifferent to it or not take pleasure in it. Aristotle wouldn't recognize that as a sensible requirement. No, you take this pleasure in the action, and to take that pleasure in this action is to do it for its own sake, because the pleasure is intrinsic to the action. It's not some separate product that one would get from it. In the way that we could view these, the pleasurable motion in my muscles as a separable product from the movement of the electric massage or the water jets in the hot tub or the thumbs of the masseuse. In that case, yes, they're separable products, the pleasure and the thing that's producing the pleasure. But here, they're not separable. They're inextricable. Now, as I said, what is kalos, what is fine, is by definition what is admirable, what is worthy of being admired. Its opposite is what is iskros, which is translated here as shameful. So this is the opposition. Fine translating kalos, and shameful translates iskros. And this has different possible translations. You could also translate this as ugly or base in the sense of low class, right? Base. Disgraceful, offensive, and so forth in different contexts. Aristotle makes clear that the motive of wanting to avoid behaving in this way is kind of the flip side of the positive motive of doing something for the sake of the fine. So to do something for the sake of the fine is also at the same time to do it for the sake of avoiding something shameful. Of course, if the emphasis is too much on this, then there may be a concern that really what you're concerned with is not the shamefulness of the action, but its dishonorableness or something like that. So the positive motive, it seems, for Aristotle is the main one, but there is also a kind of reciprocal or complementary negative motive that goes along with this. So you want to do something that's shameful, and we see that in these passages I quoted as well. This can be viewed as a powerful negative incentive. Again, though, when we're talking about avoiding the shameful, we should view this as based on the intrinsic performance of the action itself. For the virtuous person, they're motivated to do something that's shameful in their own eyes. It's not that they're primarily motivated to avoid public disgrace or public shaming, dishonor, but rather they regard the avoidance of doing a shameful thing as a worthwhile goal for its own sake, even if they would be able to get away with it and no one would know. Aristotle clearly believes that what's kalos and what's shameful are intrinsic to things. That is, there are statements of the form X is fine and X is shameful, which are simply and non-relatively true. I can say, that's a fine action, and it just be simply true. It's not just my opinion. It's not just my expressing my subjective feeling. But for Aristotle, no, things really are fine and things really are shameful, as it were, in themselves, in a straightforward and non-relative sense. Of course, to a vicious person, it may be difficult or even impossible to recognize that, running away in battle is shameful. They may view it as prudent because they're vicious. But in itself, really and objectively, so to speak, this is not Aristotelian language, of course. It's modern language, objective and subjective, but we're so used to it, it's illustrative here, I think. But objectively, it's shameful to run in battle. Objectively, it's a fine thing to stand and hold your ground with your comrades in battle. The fact that the vicious person can't see it is neither here nor there in terms of whether that proves or disproves the truth. The vicious people don't count. Their perceptions are out of whack. In the same way that someone, let's say, who's colorblind or who's lacking use of one of the five senses at all, would not be a solid barometer of what's true with respect to that sense. So through the training that occurs in the process of habituation, it seems, the appetites and the emotions develop a sensitivity to what is objectively fine and shameful. The intuition of the prudent person is the measure and standard of what is fine and what is shameful. Who determines these things? The prudent person. So those are 2 points here about these. That statements about what's fine and what's shameful can in fact be true or false. They're not just matters of opinion or the expression of a view or a feeling. They're objective, not subjective. And the one who determines truth and falsity in this domain is the prudent person. The person who has the virtue of prudence. So, the prudent person, though, need not have an explicit rule for determining what's fine and what's shameful. This goes back to Aristotle's point in Book 1 that there's a kind of inexactitude in the domain of ethics. So there's not necessarily an explicit rule that the prudent person can apply that's going to cover every case and, as it were, give you a decision procedure to tell you, is it fine or is it not, is it shameful? Or is it neither, neutral? In fact, because of all of these different particulars of the action that we see Aristotle emphasizing again and again, and that we've talked about in a couple previous videos, the particulars of the action mentioned again in some of these passages, doing it in the right amount, to the right objects, for the right duration, at the right time, etc. These particulars of the action can combine in so many different ways and can be so situation dependent that what's fine or what's shameful typically may depend on a number of situational factors. So you can't just give a kind of one-size-fits-all generic rule that would cover every case of what's fine and shameful. Okay, so what is the fine? Well, it is the beautiful or the noble. It's what's admirable. It's something that's disinterestedly and objectively pleasant in itself, not unlike the aesthetic pleasure, you might say, that we take in fine art or fine dining. There's a kind of intrinsic fineness, but it's got the connotation of nobility. So there's an ethical sense to it. It's not just merely aesthetic. It's not merely an aesthetic enjoyment. There's a kind of admirableness to it, a nobility to it. That's why it's the distinctively noble motive. And its opposite is the shameful, the ugly or base action. These things can be either true or false of certain actions, characters, objects, and that's going to be determined by the prudent person who operates in a kind of intuitive way, analogous, let's say, to the way in which people have a sense for, let's say, what's appropriate or what's tactful. You don't necessarily have a one-size-fits-all rule for that kind of thing. And similarly, the prudent person is not going to have a one-size-fits-all rule, but nonetheless is going to be able to determine what's fine or shameful in most cases. Although, interestingly, Aristotle recognized that in some cases, he mentions this with regard to the virtue of calmness, which pertains to anger. Sometimes it can be very difficult to figure out exactly what the fine thing to do is in particular circumstances. But nonetheless, if anyone can do it, it's the prudent person. And Aristotle always treats the ethical question of what should I do as if it does have some objective answer, some true answer. There is some thing that you should do and it can be ascertained. And what that is simply objectively the case. It's not a matter of opinion or subjective feeling or anything like that. Okay, so this leads to the first discussion question. Is doing an action for the sake of the fineness of an action a properly moral motive? That is doing an action out of that motivation sufficient to give the action moral worth and make the action a sign of a virtuous character? How can we understand the ontological status of fineness and shamefulness? Aristotle seems to regard these as having the status of objective states of affairs or objective properties of actions or situations, not as mere projections of internal human psychological reactions. Do you agree? If so, how would you account for their objectivity, given that it seems that they must somehow be relative to human beings? If you disagree with Aristotle, what effect do you think this has on the validity of Aristotle's theory of the virtues? That's a big question, big both in its length and also in its import. So we'll go over it one more time. First discussion question. Is doing an action for the sake of the fineness of an action a properly moral motive? That is doing an action out of that motivation sufficient to give an action moral worth and make the action a sign of a virtuous character? How can we understand the ontological status of the qualities of fineness and shamefulness? Aristotle seems to regard these as having the status of objective states of affairs or objective properties of actions and situations. Do you agree? How would you account for their objectivity? If you disagree, how do you think this affects the validity of Aristotle's theory of the virtues? Okay. Now let's examine the rest of the Aristotelian virtues of character. So first we have the virtue of generosity. And this stands as, oops, set this up here. So we have generosity, which stands opposed as intermediate to the vice of wastefulness, which is the vice of excess, and the vice of deficiency, which he calls ungenerosity. That's what we have here. So what is this? Generosity is the mean concerning disposal of money. Evidently, then, this is concerned less with the training of the appetitive part of the soul to responsiveness. But we can see the connection because we use money to satisfy our appetites, and so there's an indirect connection between the way we dispose of our money and indulging in our appetites. So generosity is contrasted with these opposed extremes of wastefulness and ungenerosity. Aristotle describes generosity as the virtue of taking wealth with the right amount of seriousness. With the right amount of seriousness. So what this means is clearest if we think of the opposite case of the wasteful person who takes wealth with insufficient seriousness and the ungenerous person who takes it with too much seriousness. So first, the wasteful person, the person guilty of the vice of excess in this domain. The wasteful person is the person who spends or gives money away willy-nilly without any sense of economy or propriety. Aristotle notes that the wasteful person and the intemperate person are often one and the same. Spending too much money at the bar, for example. That's both wasteful and intemperate. Or spending money, let's say, on prostitutes and the like. This person, as the saying goes, doesn't know the value of the dollar. Or a dollar, I think is the phrase. He throws money away like it grows on trees. Note that this person wouldn't necessarily have to be selfish. He might, for instance, be known for buying several rounds a night for everyone at the bar. But even though I think colloquially we might think of such a person as being generous, there's Joe, he's buying rounds for everyone again. For Aristotle, it's important that this person doesn't count as generous. Joe at the corner of the bar buying rounds is not generous because he doesn't take money seriously enough, which is shown by the fact that he doesn't spend it in a way that is fine and noble, but rather in a base way. Maybe he leaves big tips for the dealer at the casino too, and to the hookers he has sex with. But this is not generosity. even though it's not selfish necessarily. But it's not using money in a fine way. It's not using money in an appropriate way. It's not using money in a serious way. That's Aristotle's argument. So the wasteful person isn't going to count as generous because they don't treat money finely, we might say. At the opposite end of the spectrum is the ungenerous person who takes money too seriously to the point of hoarding it. Like the wasteful person, part of the problem with this person is that they're too indiscriminate in their dealings with money. But in their case, it's in taking in money. So there's a sense in Aristotle that even though he emphasizes generosity concerns giving primarily, there's also a sense in which there's a broader aspect of generosity, which includes the way taking in money finely as well as giving it out finely. And with the ungenerous person, this person, he thinks, is prone to indiscriminate taking in of money. They take money so seriously that they don't part with any of it at all. And they'll take it from wherever they can get it. Because of their improper attachment to money, they're even ready to take it from shameful sources. From pimping, insider stock trading would be a contemporary example of this kind of thing, which tends to be a sin, so to speak, of people who are already wealthy, but they just can't get enough. So they engage in insider stock trading. Aristotle's conception of generosity, however, is not one of all-around proper dealing in money, but especially doing the practice of giving money in the right way. And so I will remind you again of this passage I read a minute ago, where he says, at the bottom of 58, "For it is more proper to virtue to do good than to receive good, and more proper to do fine actions than to not do shameful ones." And clearly the right sort of giving implies doing good and doing fine actions. So then he says on 59, the generous person will aim at the fine in his giving. So because giving is more active rather than receiving, that's the proper exercise of the virtue of generosity. But really that makes the point that really generosity in terms of a state of character concerns dealings with money both in giving and in taking. The emphasis for Aristotle then is not merely on giving a lot, but giving the right amount in the right way. So we have that description in section 12, page 59. Actions in accord with virtue are fine and aim at the fine. Hence the generous person will also aim at the fine in his giving and will give correctly, for he will give to the right people, the right amounts at the right time, and all the other things that are implied by correct giving. Aristotle seems to be well aware of the fact that there are ways to give that are not virtuous at all, and these are not generous. For example, one might give to the wrong person in order to bribe them. That's not fine giving. Or we might give at the wrong time in order to embarrass or humiliate someone. At a cocktail party saying, "Hey, I heard you had some money problems here. Let me write you a check so you can make your rent next month," right? That would be at the wrong time in order to embarrass or humiliate someone publicly. Or one might give too much in order to show up a rival. This is a well-known phenomenon among, people, let's say, who have a common friend, and so this is why you have to set, for Secret Santa or whatever, they set amounts for how much your gift should be, because otherwise there's a natural human tendency to want to show someone else up by giving more than the next person, right? And of course, one might give just to gain honors for oneself, rather than because it is the fine thing to do. In sum, while generosity is the virtue concerned with giving money, it involves an overall attitude to money that involves more than the willingness to give. It involves the proper degree of seriousness and respect for using money in a way that's noble and fine rather than base or shameful. So that is generosity. Now the next one is also concerned with the disposal of money, but specifically a large sum of money. And this Aristotle considers a distinct virtue. He calls this magnificence. And the vice of excess here is ostentation, and the vice of deficiency is stinginess. So it is magnificent to dispose of large sums of money finely, but disposing of large sums of money in an excessive way becomes ostentatious. And if you have a large sum of money but you don't dispose of it, you're stingy. You're Ebenezer Scrooge. Now, the first thing, of course, from a modern perspective, we want to know is what's Aristotle's rationale for distinguishing magnificence from generosity? Why is merely the amount of the money sufficient to distinguish two separate virtues? One approach would be to look at the differing vices first. One notices immediately that the vices that become possible seem worse in the case of magnificence. That is, remember the wasteful person, is just Joe at the bar who's buying rounds every night before he schleps off with, the streetwalker on the corner. And that's shameful and so forth. But an ostentatious person seems like more of a jerk. Someone who's sort of, showing off, spending money in gaudy and in ways that seem designed to humiliate people. Ostentation could be a way of degrading and diminishing others, making them feel inferior. And that's the wasteful person, doesn't do that. Similarly, stinginess seems worse than just being ungenerous. Being sort of frugal or thrifty seems close to being ungenerous. Whereas to be stingy, that's an Ebenezer Scrooge type character, a particularly appalling type character. Here you are, very wealthy, and yet you make poor old Bob Cratchit work on Christmas Eve or what have you. So that's one way to think about why there needs to be a separate virtue, because we might say with great wealth comes great responsibility. There's a danger once a person is capable of disposing of great wealth of falling into worse vices than if they had a modest amount of wealth. Another reason to separate out magnificence is Aristotle's purpose to offer advice to the statesman about how to promote happiness in the polis. It's clear that the magnificent person, if he acts finely, is of great usefulness to enhancing a city, and further details about the cultural context can be found in Terence Irwin's footnote to this section about the practice of the public-minded funding projects and this sort of thing. But if you look at page 64, sections 11 and 12, he says, this sort of excellence is found in the expenses that are called honorable, such as expenses for the gods, dedications, temples, sacrifices, and so on, for everything divine, and in expenses that provoke a good competition for honor, for the common. If, for instance, some city thinks a splendid chorus or worship or a feast for the city must be provided. That is, there does seem to be a different kind of virtue that's present, let's say, in the benefactor who decides to, fund a new church renovation for, Our Lady of Perpetual Help down the street. We're going to completely renovate the church, and that's going to be funded by this individual. That's more than just generously giving to the collection plate every week. But in all cases, as we said, we fix the right amount by reference to the agent as well as the task, by who he is and what resources he has, for the amounts must be worthy of these, fitting the producer as well as the result. One natural objection that post-Christian people have to the inclusion of magnificence in the list of the 11 essential virtues might be that the possession of this virtue requires a special and unequal amount of external goods. And Aristotle is clear that a poor person can never be magnificent. He says this straight up in section 13, right below where I read. A poor person cannot be magnificent. And we naturally shrink back from this. We say, why should a person be considered less good merely because they're poor? This offends our post-Christian sense of justice. But here I think it's helpful to go back to Aristotle's notion of eudaimonia and its connotation of being successful in life. Successful in life. And is there any connection between magnificence and being a success in life? In my country, the United States of America, the unqualified use of the term successful is standardly used to refer to the size of one's monetary and material assets. Standardly, I mean, that's a synonym. We assume if you say that he's successful, you assume that he's got money. Also, we might notice here that one of the magnificent expenditures that Aristotle mentions is a wedding in section 15, page 65. And once again, I think there are many people in my country, as well as elsewhere, who might think their life had been ruined, that their life had been a failure if they were unable to have a lavish wedding. At least judging from several reality TV shows, that seems to be the case. So maybe this idea that magnificence is a distinctive virtue that's essential for success in life isn't actually so foreign to our way of thinking after all, even though we're post-Christian egalitarians otherwise. If virtue is human excellence, it seems like it's not so far off from our own attitude to say that a poor person really can't be fully virtuous. Or we might say they can't be great. Okay, but that's a controversial one. And here's another controversial one. Magnanimity. Magnanimity. The vice of excess would be vanity, and the vice of deficiency would be pusillanimity. Pusillanimity. So what's the domain? This is the domain of the desire for great honor. Which I think in our own day is not necessarily considered an everyday commonplace desire that everyone has. Certainly, it's reasonable to say someone who aspires to be an Olympic medalist and is training as such, has a concern with this domain, has a desire for great honors. But whether the average person has a desire for great honors is another question. But at any rate, this is what the domain of magnanimity is. Now, if we're good at the verbal portion of standardized tests, or we like to read the dictionary for fun, we might be familiar with the English word magnanimous, which of course is a form of magnanimity. And magnanimous is generally taken to be a synonym for forgiving in a patronizing way. You're magnanimous if you're forgiving someone, but you're forgiving in a kind of patronizing way. Or merciful to one's perceived inferiors. A magnanimous person is slow to take a justified revenge because he sees such actions as beneath himself. That's being magnanimous. One can see in all these definitions of the contemporary English word more than a whiff or hint of snobbery, condescension, and aristocratic airs. One of Aristotle's descriptions of magnanimity captures our sense of the modern English word pretty well. This is a later description of page 69, section 26. So he speaks of the magnanimous person. When the magnanimous person meets people with good fortune or a reputation for worth, he displays his greatness. Since superior over them is difficult and impressive, and there is nothing ignoble in trying to be impressive with them. But when the magnanimous person meets ordinary people, he is moderate, since superior over them is easy, and an attempt to be impressive among inferiors is as vulgar as a display of strength against the weak. We can see in this passage where the whiff of arrogance and snobbery attached to the word magnanimous, even today, comes from. And all of this is present in Aristotle's sense of magnanimity. But the core of its attitude is knowing that one is worthy of great honors and seeking them for oneself as one's due. So that's what this is. Knowing oneself worthy of great honors and seeking them as one's due. You might even insert a merely here, just to give the sense of it. A magnanimous person is, or a person who has the quality of magnanimity, has the quality of knowing themselves to be worthy of great honors, and they merely seek them as their due. They're just due. That's what it is to be magnanimous for Aristotle. So we see this, if you look at the top of page 67, section 9. If then he thinks he is worthy of great things and is worthy of them, especially of the greatest things, he has one concern above all. Worth is said to make oneself worthy of external goods, and we would suppose that the greatest of these is the one we award to the gods, the one above all that is the aim of people with a reputation for worth, the prize for the finest achievements. And all this is true of honor, since it is the greatest of external goods. Hence, the magnanimous person has the right concern with honors and dishonors. And even without argument, it appears that magnanimous people are concerned with honor. For the great think themselves worthy of honor most of all, but in accord with their worth. And so how this plays out is described down in section 17, bottom of the same page. The magnanimous person, when he is concerned especially with honors and dishonors, when he receives great honors from excellent people, he will be moderately pleased, thinking he is getting what is proper to him, or even less. For there can be no honor worthy of complete virtue. But still he will accept honors from excellent people, since they have nothing greater to award him. But if he is honored by just anyone, or for something small, he will altogether make light of it. For that is not what he is worthy of. And similarly he will make light of dishonor, for it will not be justly attached to him. That's the attitude of the magnanimous person. So the domain of magnanimity then is the desire for great honors, but it's the desire sort of coupled with this kind of sense of entitlement. Because of course I'm great, so I deserve great honors. That's the state of mind of the magnanimous person for Aristotle. For Aristotle, it's only possible to be a magnanimous person if you're genuinely entitled to great honors. If you think you're entitled to great honors and you're really not, then you're guilty of vanity. But this, of course, raises the question, who is entitled to great honors? And Aristotle's answer is clear. It's only the person who possesses all of the other virtues. So, and of course, this, keeping in mind what we've just seen about magnificence, this assumes that this is going to be a wealthy person. That's a condition. You can't be a magnanimous person for Aristotle unless you possess great wealth and moreover are disposing of your wealth in a magnificent way. But beyond that, you also have to be brave and temperate and all of the other virtues. So in section 14, he says, since the magnanimous person is worthy of the greatest things, he is the best person. For in every case, the better person is worthy of something greater, and the best person is worthy of the greatest things. Hence, the truly magnanimous person must be good. Section 16, he says, magnanimity then would seem to be a sort of adornment of the virtues, for it makes them greater, and does not arise without them. That is why it is difficult to be truly magnanimous, since it is not possible without being fine and good. The magnanimity is described as kind of the cherry on the top of the virtue sundae, right? You've got to have all the other ingredients, and then magnanimity is just kind of the adornment on the top. The magnanimous person is always going to be the person who possesses all of the virtues, or in an alternative phrase that Aristotle uses, who possesses complete virtue. And therefore, the magnanimous person is the all-around good person, because only the good person is honorable, as Aristotle says. However, Aristotle concedes that if a good person is also well-born, powerful, or rich, this will also enhance their magnanimity. And in fact, it seems like they have to be rich, as I just said, because they can't possess the virtue of magnificence without being rich. So in section 19, he says, for the well-born and the powerful or rich are thought worthy of honor, since they are in a superior position, and everything superior in some good is more honored. That is why these things make people more magnanimous. But really, it's clear he doesn't think that just being well-born, just being born with a silver spoon in your mouth or born into a famous family is enough to make you a magnanimous person. You can't just be born heir to the throne of England and be magnanimous. So magnanimity is defined as the mean between desiring more honor than one is due, that would be vanity, desiring more honor than one is due, or desiring or accepting, we might say, less honor than one is due. Desiring more honor than one is rightfully due, and desiring less or accepting less honor than one is rightfully due. In a post-Christian, democratic, egalitarian world, once again, magnanimity is thought to be the vice of vanity itself, the opposite of the virtue of humility. And so this is a controversial inclusion, although maybe in our culture it's making a comeback in the hip-hop world. For Aristotle, there's no particular virtue in being humble. Instead, he would view the Christian so-called virtue of humility as a kind of pusillanimity, a form of cowardice or timidity that's afraid of demanding the respect to which one is entitled. A pusillanimous person is someone who lets people diss them without payback, a timid little church mouse. So this is the way that Aristotle views the Christian virtue of humility as being really pusillanimity. To make the better case for this as an actual vice, of humility is actually pusillanimity, an actual vice, we might appeal to the health of one's soul, the health of the person's soul, or the health of the psyche, which is the Greek word for soul, which goes back to the function argument. One might say that the magnanimous person has a healthy soul insofar as he has a healthy self-image and healthy self-esteem. It's crucial that this high self-esteem be deserved. We might say, someone who's won an Olympic gold medal might have a high opinion of themselves, but that's good. They should. And they should be happy. They've done something great. They should expect to, be admired for it, and that should be part of what contributes to their happiness, part of their self-esteem. By contrast, a vain person who demands more honor and respect than he's entitled to or really deserves is under a kind of delusion and is unlikely to win friends and influence people. Aristotle says they are foolish and do not know themselves. As a result of their delusion, they're liable to bite off more than they can chew and, embarrass themselves, get themselves into trouble. And you can see Aristotle's remarks on this in section 36 on page 70, which I won't read. And a pusillanimous person might be described as a person with low self-esteem to an unhealthy degree. Aristotle's description illustrates this, page 70, section 35. For the pusillanimous person is worthy of goods, but deprives himself of the goods he is worthy of, and would seem to have something bad in him, because he does not think he is worthy of the goods. Indeed, he would seem not to know himself, for if he did, he would aim at the things he is worthy of, since they are goods. For all that, such people seem hesitant rather than foolish. But this belief of theirs seems to make them worse. For each sort of person seeks what he thinks he is worth, and these people hold back from fine actions and practices, and equally from external goods, because they think they are unworthy of them. So there's something psychologically off in the pusillanimous person, is the way he's describing them. This leads to the second discussion question. Second of three, I shall note. Do you think that magnificence and magnanimity are genuine virtues? If so, why? If not, why not? Can a person of modest means or an ordinary person who's not worthy of great honors be as excellent and happy overall as a rich or highly accomplished person? Why or why not? Does the inclusion of magnificence or magnanimity increase or decrease the plausibility of Aristotle's eudaimonistic conception of the human good? That is what I was talking about in terms of happiness as being successful in life and so on, that conception of the human good. Okay, so once again, second discussion question. Do you think that magnificence and magnanimity are genuine virtues? If so, why? If not, why not? Can a person of modest means or an ordinary person who's not worthy of great honors be as excellent and happy overall as a rich or highly accomplished person? Why or why not? Does the inclusion of magnificence or magnanimity increase or decrease the plausibility of Aristotle's eudaimonistic conception of the good? That's the second discussion question. And P.S. we'll have one more question to come at the end. Okay, next up is the virtue concerned with small honors, and we can make small work or quick work of this one. This virtue, which has no name, stands to magnanimity as generosity stands to magnificence, and Aristotle makes the comparison. In other words, this is the budget version of the virtue that's concerned with seeking great honors. He says, page 71, but as we said in the first discussion, just as there is a virtue for small-scale giving, there would also seem to be a virtue concerned with honor, for it seems related to magnanimity in the way that generosity is related to magnificence. For it abstains, just as generosity does, from anything great, but forms the right attitude in us on medium and small matters. Just as the taking and giving of money admits of a mean, an excess and deficiency, so we can desire honor more or less than is right, and we can desire it from the right sources and in the right way. So even the plebes, even the plebeians, even the hoi polloi, the common people, have a desire for honor. They cannot hope to possibly receive in a fine way great honors, but they could hope for medium level, small level honors. And so there's got to be a virtue that does this in the right way. And the vice here would be someone who's an honor lover who is, here we might think of, this modern phenomenon where everyone, it seems, wants to be famous for 15 minutes, right? Someone who goes around, sometimes you might notice if you watch reality television that sometimes the same people end up showing up in different reality shows, right? They're people that just want to be on TV. That kind of sense, I think Aristotle regarded as a vice of wanting these small-scale honors too much. So we need to have a virtue, but it has no name, for the regulation of wanting honor, but because it's a natural human desire, but not too much. Okay, so much for that one. Now, the next domain concerns another one of these more bestial, or we might say animalistic, parts of the appetitive part of the soul, and this is anger. And here, we're more aware of the vice of excess than either the virtue or the vice of deficiency. Because the vice of excess is going to be what he calls Eraskability. Eraskability, which is a word that probably you don't use every day. Basically, this includes a person who would be, we would say they have a temper, right? They're a hothead. That kind of person is an irascible person, right? They're liable to fly off the handle. They get angry at the drop of a hat. You don't want to trigger them because you might get punched in the nose. That vice is the one that Aristotle thinks we need to be concerned with. Also, though, and this is why I think he uses this, the translator uses this kind of unusual word, irascible. it can have a kind of slow burn version, and that would be bitterness, right? Bitter people who aren't ready to fly off the handle, but who are angry all the time on a kind of slow burn, who might snap at you, right? They're not going to punch you, but they're going to, be grouchy all the time and bitter. That would also be included in this. And then on the other hand, you have people who never get angered, right? And I mean, this is just described as inerascible, but so I'm not even going to bother to write that, but just I'll put the people who never get angered at an offense. So, these are essentially instead of a hothead, this is something like a doormat, right? Someone who gets insulted, gets picked on, gets made fun of, and they never do anything. They never get angry. And it's not that maybe they have no reaction, and that Aristotle thinks is weird, basically. This is a person, and the person appears foolish. I think there seems to be something off about the person. They seem foolish or slavish. They behave like a slave who can't retaliate, can't do anything. And so the mean is going to be calmness. And this was the one, as I mentioned earlier, that Aristotle thinks can be very difficult to figure out what this is. I mean, it's a strange word because calmness doesn't mean, of course, that the person is always calm, because then they'd be guilty of this divisive deficiency of never getting angry. But what this means is that they're angry sort of in a controlled way. This is, they'll get their revenge, but revenge is best served cold. They get angry, but they don't get angry in such a way as they lose their head. They don't get angry, of course, at the wrong objects in the wrong way at the wrong times. They don't hold a grudge. They're not angry for a long time. That's what the bitter person does. They get angry for excessively long. They sin against duration in terms of the particulars of the action. Whereas the calm person, they might get angry, they slug it out, and then they forget about it. That's the idea. So there's a dealing with anger that's virtuous, and there's two different forms of dealing with anger that's vicious. Okay. Now, part of the appetite that human beings possess is an appetite for sociability. We'll call this appetite for society and company. Sociability. The mean here would be friendliness. There is such a thing as being too friendly, and this is being ingratiating. And the divisive deficiency is being not friendly enough, being quarrelsome and cantankerous. Think of that scene in Goodfellas where Ray Liotta's character tells Joe Pesci's character, he's laughing at a joke or something, he said a story he told, and he says, you're a funny guy. And Joe Pesci's response is, what, I'm funny? What, you mean like I amuse you like a clown? That's, I think, a perfect picture of what it is to be quarrelsome and cantankerous. Joe Pesci's just trying to be friendly, and the response is to be quarrelsome and cantankerous. We're all aware of someone who's ingratiating. Aristotle describes this on 73 as, in meeting people living together and in common dealings, conversations, and actions, some people seem to be ingratiating. These are the ones who praise everything in order to please us and never cross us, but think they must cause no pain to those they meet. These sort of smarmy people who are constantly kissing your butt and praising you and saying, how wonderful you are and so on. That's being overly friendly. That's being ingratiating. And it's awkward and uncomfortable, and therefore it causes pain. And that's what Aristotle is concerned with here, actually. Both of these extremes, they cause pain. They cause social pain, as we might describe it. Awkwardness, uncomfortableness, offense, and at the extremes, they may even cause someone to feel threatened and so forth. So friendliness is the virtue of being pleasant to be around. Being pleasant to be around. That's the friendly person. And these are the people who are painful to be around. Either being because they're too nice or because they're too mean. Too cheery or too much of a Debbie Downer. Or a barking dog who's threatening. Okay? Next is the virtue of truthfulness. And this is another one where Aristotle is actually thinking first, I think, of in the same domain of the areas that interactions with people cause us this kind of social pain, this sort of social discomfort. And one of these is certainly when you're dealing with a boastful person. And also the opposite extreme of a self-deprecating person. Now, truthfulness might be a strange way to describe the mean between being boastful and being self-deprecating. And we might say, well, is this truthfulness yes, that's the virtue of being truthful, telling the truth. I think there's actually something to be said here. It's not actually quite as narrow as you might think, because even though Aristotle isn't talking here about the virtue of honesty in general, it might be that he's talking about the virtue of honesty in society. And there is a relation to honesty in general here. I think Aristotle recognizes that when we lie in society, paradigmatically, this is to make ourselves look better in some way. Few people are true pathological liars. So we think if we take a wider view of boastfulness or self-deprecating. So to take an example, someone says, "Hey, would you like to donate?" As they ask you at the grocery store or whatever, "Would you like to donate to a charity X?" And you say, "Oh no, I already gave at the office," and you're lying. Right? Why did you do that? Well, in a way, there's a kind of boastfulness. Of course, you're not boastful in the classical sense of telling someone about your accomplishments, but you're building yourself up in an unjustified way because for some reason you're afraid of looking bad in the eyes of the grocery checker, and so you lie. And so much of, I would dare say maybe 99% of the lies that we tell in society are actually forms of trying to make ourselves look better. And so being truthful and saying, no, I didn't. That's a virtue. I didn't, and I don't want to give money to this charity. That's being truthful. So Aristotle is concerned with the avoidance of the vices of boastfulness and self-deprecation in that sense. These are vices that are distinct from the vices of honor-loving, vanity, and pusillanimity by virtue of the fact that Aristotle is concerned with actual lying, dishonesty, and exaggeration of your merits, either directly or indirectly. Indirectly, for example, by claiming you did something that you didn't do, and so forth. So with the honor-loving, the vain, or the pusillanimous, there's not necessarily lying or dishonesty involved in these things. There's a different kind of virtue, or vice, the expectation, for example, of more honors than one is worth, expecting people to give that to you. That's the vice here. Whereas here, it would be actually lying in order to make yourself look better. So that is to be avoided. Okay. Just two left. And we're sticking with the virtues of social interaction. Here, we might describe as the domain of laughter, the part of the appetitive soul. This is a need for human beings normally, to laugh. Or more broadly, to have amusement. Part of the appetitive soul that needs to be attended to, and that can be done excessively or deficiently. And the vice of excess is the buffoon. The vice of deficiency is the bore, or the person with no sense of humor. And the mean is wit. You can think of this as wittiness, but wit, I think, is good because wit also has a connotation of being quick-witted. Wit would contribute, for example, into being a good conversationalist, being able to pick up on what there's an art of conversation, of course, being able to pick up on what someone said and extend the conversation in an interesting direction so that the conversation can continue to be amusing. And of course, there's going to be typically some kind of joke or humor, but it doesn't need to be wittiness in the sense of cracking jokes all the time. It's just sort of being like, we could describe this also as being sort of a good-humored person. I might even put this, even though this isn't the way Aristotle puts it, I might even put this as an alternative. The contrast with the bore, the person who has no sense of humor, the person with wit is a good-humored person, Maybe they're not a talented comedian, but they can get a joke. They can occasionally make a little quip, right? And they're friendly and pleasant to be around. Just like the friendly person, just like the person who's truthful, the person with wit is pleasant to be around in society. So these virtues of friendliness, truthfulness, and wit kind of go together. Just as humans have a natural appetite for company and social interaction, so too we have a natural appetite for amusements to help us relax. Wit is a means concerned with such amusements or concerning laughter. We need to, we might say, vent the pressure of life and laugh occasionally. And we would all probably agree that there's such a thing as excessive proneness to laughter, and also such a thing as deficiency when it comes to cracking a smile. Someone who will never, Mr. Spock from Star Trek, paradigm example, right? As with friendliness in society, both an excess and a deficiency with respect to laughter can be a cause of pain. These can be, in very different ways, painful people to be around, the buffoon and the bore. Someone who's always making everything into a joke, who's constantly making fun of everyone, is an unpleasant person to be around. He causes as much pain as an unfriendly person, as a grouchy person, or as a cantankerous person, quarrelsome person. So this would be the buffoon. But at the other extreme is a person he calls a bore. And I think usually we think of a bore as someone who maybe makes inappropriate jokes or, offensive jokes, inappropriate gross humor, or, sexist, racist jokes or something like that. So it's a little bit of an odd term because it may capture that. It's someone who is not good humored, would be a way to put it, who doesn't have a sense of humor, who's someone you can't joke around with. So certainly someone who never cracks a smile would be an example of that, but maybe someone who would be, not have an appropriate sense of humor, an awkward person. Certainly this person would be someone who's also quick to take offense at every joke, could be considered a type of a bore. Right? This person thinks everything's a joke. This person thinks nothing's a joke. So a form of that would be to be kind of a party pooper, someone with no sense of humor, someone who takes offense at every joke, even an innocent one, and so forth. Okay, so that's wit. And then finally, very quickly, there's shame. It belongs to the human appetitive part of the soul that we have a sense of shame. Aristotle does not think it proper to treat shame itself as an actual virtue, since it's really a feeling, not a state. However, the disposition to be shamed at the right things, at the right time, to the right extent, is a virtue at a certain time of life, he says, because it's a mean between being too prone to shame and being shameless. But it's not a universal virtue. It's only a virtue in young people, he says, section 3, page 78. I won't bother to read that because we're short on time, but the point is that for decent adults, a proper propensity to shame, if anything, should be just sort of hypothetical, because they shouldn't do things that would cause them shame. So they're not actually going to experience shame. It's not really going to be an issue. It's going to be sort of an idle, standing possibility, but it's only hypothetical for them. But for young people, it's good if the young people are kind of prone to shame, because that way they'll develop virtues. That's the idea. All right. So that completes Aristotle's list of 11 virtues. Once again, we have bravery, temperance, generosity, magnificence, magnanimity, and the virtue with no name concerning small honors, calmness, friendliness, truthfulness, wit, and shame. This leads to the third discussion question. After examining the particular Aristotelian virtues of character, do you believe that any of these should be removed from the list of essential human ethical virtues, or that any should be added? Which ones and why?